It is impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain, but once conceived, it haunted me day and night. Object there was none, passion there was none. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. He had never given me insult. For his gold I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. He had the eye of a vulture, a pale, blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold. And so, by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man, and thus rid myself of the eye forever. This is Carolina Haints. The briskness of fall, the changing leaves, football games, pumpkins. It's a time for trick-or-treating, for hayrides and bonfires and s'mores, for laughing and candy. Or at least it should be. But some people see it as an excuse to do other things. There are some sick people out there. In Season 4, we discussed the infamous toolbox murders in which Halloween was a chosen date for real horror. We covered the disturbing Halloween murder of Martha Moxley in Bellhaven, Connecticut in Season 6. Now, we've got a few more macabre tales of murder on All Hallows Eve. Let's start with the trick-or-treat murder of Peter Fabiano. On Halloween night 1957, Peter Fabiano opened the door to a trick-or-treater. The person seemed a little too old to be begging for candy, and they hadn't put much time into their costume, which was just a hard plastic store-bought mask and a brown paper lunch bag. But Peter shrugged and reached to hand them some candy, and that's when the person reached inside the paper bag and shot Peter twice in the chest. The shots were heard by Peter's wife Betty and their daughter, who rushed to the door to find him bleeding and no one else in sight. Peter Fabiano died on the way to the hospital. There was only one witness, and all they saw was a car speeding away from the scene. Peter owned 2 successful beauty salons in Los Angeles, but nothing was taken from the house. When the police asked Betty if her husband had any enemies, she could only think of one: Joan Rebel. During the 1940s and early 50s, Joan had been very successful as a writer and photographer, but a bitter divorce had left her in need of a more stable job. She found employment in one of the beauty salons owned by Fabiano. Joan became fast friends with Betty and spent a lot of time with the Fabiano family. Later, when the Fabianos began having trouble with their marriage, Betty moved in with Joan for a few months. Or at least that's what they told people. In reality, Joan was the cause of the Fabianos' problems. Joan and Betty were having an affair. In 1957, this was not at all acceptable by society norms. Betty ultimately reconciled with Peter and ended the affair, but Joan was extremely bitter, despite the fact that she was already seeing someone new herself, Goldine Pfizer. Still, Joan hated Peter for taking Betty away from her. As Joan seduced Goldine, she constantly griped about the evil Peter Fabiano, who had taken Betty away from her. After months of this, she convinced Goldine to shoot Peter Fabiano. Both Joan and Goldine were charged and convicted with second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. They were both released about 30 years later. Halloween, 2012. John Douglas White found himself bored. Sitting around drinking beer and watching snuff porn just wasn't doing it for him tonight. The former pastor started thinking about his neighbor. It wasn't the first time he had thought of her. 24-year-old Rebecca Gay had recently moved in the mobile home next to his after separating from her husband. White decided he wanted to live out his snuff film fantasies. He drank a few more beers, then he went next door. He kicked down the door, knocked Rebecca unconscious, and then strangled her. He stripped her naked and then, found himself unable to perform. And he did all this while her 3-year-old son watched. White later told authorities that he felt no remorse for killing Rebecca, but that he did feel uncomfortable leaving the child there by himself. So he dressed the boy in his Halloween costume and drove him to his father's house to go trick-or-treating. October 2004. 3 friends in Napa, California had moved into a house together. Lauren Minza, Leslie Mazzara, and Adrienne Insomnia. Adrienne's close friend and co-worker Lily Prudhomme and her fiancé Eric Koppel helped the women move in. At some point during the day, the girls decided to have some people over on Halloween to celebrate. Not a party really, just a few close friends for an earlier dinner party. Even though Lily and Eric were scheduled to get married the next day, they immediately accepted their invitation. Unfortunately, the couple split up just before Halloween, and neither of them attended the dinner. In fact, the party was over early enough for the young ladies to pass out some trick-or-treat candy before going to bed. Leslie and Adrienne slept in the 2 bedrooms upstairs while Lauren occupied the room on the first floor with her dog. Around 2 a.m., Lauren awoke to the sound of breaking glass and found her dog growling at the bedroom door. It frightened her, and then she heard Adrienne scream from upstairs. She ran outside in the backyard to hide. She saw a man flee the house, but it was too dark to identify him. Finally, she got the nerve to go back inside, where she found Leslie lying face down in a pool of blood, and Adrienne badly wounded but hiding behind her bed. Both women had been stabbed multiple times. Adrienne bled out shortly after the ambulance arrived. There was no apparent motive to the crime. Nothing had been taken from the house, and the women had not been sexually assaulted, but the numerous stab wounds indicated the attack had been one of rage and anger. There was a massive investigation. They interviewed almost 1,500 people and took a couple hundred DNA samples. There was a Camel Turkish blend cigarette butt found outside the house, and since none of the women smoked, the police surmised that it may have been discarded by the killer. But after all that investigating, a cigarette butt and a couple of drops of blood were all they had. DNA testing revealed that the subject was of European descent and probably had blue or green eyes and blonde hair. None of that was particularly out of place in Napa. They followed up on several dead-end leads, including one accusation that the girls were dealing drugs and it was a gang hit. Other rumors centered around Leslie, who was a former Miss South Carolina contestant. One rumor claimed that the father of an ex-boyfriend had become obsessed with her and was stalking her. Another rumor accused Francis Ford Coppola, who owned a winery where Leslie worked. Of course, none of these rumors would pan out. Despite their exhaustive efforts, the police were at a complete loss until someone walked into their office and confessed. Remember Lily and Eric, who ended their engagement after helping the girls move in? Well, neither of them attended the dinner party that night, and instead both decided to go to some other parties. Unbeknownst to them, they had chosen the same party. They had planned to get married the next day, so emotions were high, and they had a huge argument. In the end, Eric stormed off, but his rage never subsided. He was upset over the breakup, and as he drove around, he turned his anger to a new target. Adrienne, Lily's friend, who he had helped move in. Lily and Adrian were planning a trip to Australia together. He decided that Adrian must have turned Lily against him. She was the reason they split up. He broke into the house and went upstairs. Adrian's room would be one of the two, but he didn't know which. He chose one at random and crept inside, stabbing the sleeping woman in the bed. She tried to run, but he tackled her, stabbing her in the back over and over. Then, the door opened. It was then that he realized he had killed Leslie. Adrian stood in the doorway. She screamed like he had never heard and attacked him. Yeah, she actually attacked him. Her screams were cut short by his knife, but they had awoken Lauren downstairs. He stabbed Adrian multiple times before he heard Lauren's dog barking and ran away. Leslie was already dead, a pool of blood slowly spreading outward. Adrian pulled herself behind the bed to hide, but she was also losing a lot of blood. She passed out shortly after Lauren found her and died when an ambulance arrived. Her mother would later say,
"My baby never wore a turtleneck sweater in her life, and yet she had to be buried in one. And still, it couldn't hide the extent of her wounds."
She was, of course, referring to the funeral, which Lily and Eric attended together. That's right. After Halloween, the couple reconciled and were married the following February. They even invited Adrian's mother to the wedding and played her favorite song as a tribute. At a loss, almost a year after the killings, the police decided to announce their meager findings to the public in hopes of new leads. After all their efforts, the only clues remained the Camel cigarette butt and a few drops of blood. They didn't expect what happened next. Eric Koppel showed up with his wife and other members of his family to confess. He even volunteered his DNA. Despite their exhaustive investigation, conducting nearly 1,500 interviews, they had never talked to Koppel. He was sentenced to life without parole. During the trial, Eric expressed remorse and called himself a broken man.
"I cannot fathom an explanation for my sinful deeds. The terrible agony inflicted upon a great number of people. My relationship with Lily was crashing. It was all like it fertilized the seed of anger in my heart. There was rage inside me. If I had only listened to those who pleaded with me to get the help I needed."
Lily stood by him at the trial, saying that the Eric she knew was a gentle man, and
"There was nothing in this world that you could do that would make me love you less."
Until she filed for divorce a few months later. To learn more about these stories, check out ForensicFilesNow.com, Grunge.com, Ranker.com, and TrueCrimeEdition.com. The special Halloween episode was researched and written by Jeffrey Cochran and was produced and hosted by me, Dan Sellers. Special thanks to the extraordinary Liz Z. Pardue for providing additional vocal talents to this episode. You can find all the spooky things she's got going on at sisterhoodofspirits.com. You can find everything about our production company, Wreak Havoc Productions, at our website, wreakhavocproductions.com. This podcast is also brought to you by Carolina Haynes, Inc., a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting folklore storytelling throughout the Carolinas. You can help us on our mission by joining our team on Patreon. With monthly contributions of $5, $10, or $25, you can receive perks such as the Carolina Haynes Map of Monsters and Legends, a behind-the-scenes video series, and monthly mini-episodes that are exclusive for members. Just visit patreon.com/Carolina Haynes. You can find the Carolina Haynes podcast on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, and YouTube. Please leave us a review and share it with a friend today. You can find everything about us, including the Carolina Haynes book, and tour dates for upcoming appearances on our website, carolinahaines.com. Be sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram, simply at Carolina Haynes. And feel free to contact us directly at carolinahaines@gmail.com. Thank you, dear listeners. And although everyone's entitled to one good scare, we hope you have a safe and happy Halloween. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. Tune in then to hear more about those things that go bump in the night.